In this video, we're going to take a look at the Atramentis Artist Green. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. There's a slight bit, the slightest bit of tone variation for this ink depending on the pen that you put it into. Really, it has no shading at all. And so if you're looking for that solid green tone, this is what you really want to go for. I did find this to be a bit aggressive on a bunch of papers. And if you're using cheaper papers, you're really going to see a lot of bleed through as an issue. And the thing is, you can see this ink pushing its way into the paper and really forcing that bond with it. And as I could see that, that's what made me concerned about the amount of bleed through that happened. Now, with half-decent paper, this really isn't a problem. As a solid green, it is a very pleasant tone, and I like to look at it. But I can say that I generally prefer my greens to have some shading. So that just means that for me, I'm not really looking at a bottle of this, but I do see this as a very good green ink. And being an artist ink where mostly you're really going to think about it for doing drawings and maybe painting over, it's a really good thing. And especially because a lot of times doing art, you don't just want black lines. So if you're looking at using it to make green lines for your pictures and really green a lot in your art, I think this is very interesting to use. The thing that really does stand out is that lack of shading, that it makes it harder to get those darker tones when you're putting your lines down, because darker, thicker lines tend to show something's closer. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Pelikan M805 with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we have a nice light green that is definitely dark enough to read without any kind of a problem. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get zero shading whatsoever. Just a nice light green the entire time. Pleasant on this paper, really shows off its color. Looking at the medium nib, it is only the tiniest bit darker than we had with the fine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has no shading. So again, a good, solid performing, solid green line the whole way through. Looking at the stub nib, we see that it is a little bit lighter than we had with the medium, about the same tone that we had with the fine. There's no feather, there's no spread, there's no shading, there is only solid green goodness. Looking at the back of the page, it is noticeable that there's quite a bit of ghosting, especially on the medium, but there is no bleed through that touches the page underneath. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pilot Metropolitan with a fine nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a medium nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a 1.0 stub, The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, we have about the same nice green tone that we were getting on the Clairfontaine. Very nice that this paper really hasn't altered its tone. We have no feather, we have no spread, we have no shading. So it works really good, and I think on this paper it can be a really good option to go with, especially since as a reporter notebook it's really a go outside kind of notebook, so the elements can be kind of their own issue. Looking at the medium nib, just as on the Clairfontaine, it's a little bit darker than we had with the fine. There's no feather, no spread, no shading. But I think I actually, for this paper, like that darker green just a little bit more. Looking at the stub, it is right about the same tone that we had with the medium. We do see tiny bits of feather that occur at different times, but they're really tiny and incredibly manageable. There's no spread at all, and there's absolutely no shading whatsoever. Looking at the back of the page, we have no ghosting and no bleeding. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it looks just a little bit darker, I think, than what we were getting on the Clairfontaine as a color comparison, but probably right about the same tone as we had with that medium. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading, it's actually doing very well. This is a slightly off-white paper, and I think it's really holding on to its tones very well. The medium nib is a bit darker than what we had with the fine. There is tiny feathers that do occur. Totally manageable, not something that would stop you from using it. There's the faintest amount of spread. It is not a Japanese medium here. It's not a Western medium. So there is a tiny bit of spread, but again, not really an issue. Still, no shading, only green goodness. Looking at the stub nib, we get a tone that is just a little bit lighter than we had with the fine. So this is the lightest tone on the page. We have a tiny bit of feathering that is occurring. We have a tiny bit of spread. And believe it or not, we have one or two speckles that show up of shading. I feel like it got in there on accident. I don't really see people using a stub nib to take notes on a reporter's notebook, but if you do, then it's going to be okay. Looking at the back of the page, the medium had a tiny bit that was starting to get deep into the page. You're really, the ghosting is very minimal, and without a doubt, there's no bleed through. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get the same nice light green tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. We have no feathering, we have no spread, we have no shading. This paper is really very good. It's become one of my favorite reporter notebooks, without a doubt. The medium nib is quite a bit darker than we had with the fine. There is tiny feathering, quite a bit through it. Not distracting, but definitely there. There is a little bit of spread that is certainly occurring, taking it almost up to a Western medium. Quite a bit of spread. Not stopping you from being able to read what's on the page. And there is no shading whatsoever. The stub nib is just a little bit lighter than we have with the medium, just a hair, but it's noticeably darker than the fine. There's a tiny bit of feathering that does occur, and it's only in a few spots. Really, you have to go looking for it. So I consider this as doing fairly well, probably the drier nature of stubs. Now, there's no spread. There's one or two spots that show up a little bit darker. I guess we could call it as a little bit of shading, but again, more accidental than anything else. Looking at the back of the page, you see there is a lot of ghosting. You can't use the back of the page, but you could definitely, because it doesn't bleed through and touch the other page. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Colorverse Schrodinger. Here is Diamine Emerald. Here is Geherban Lyre Sauvage. Here is Krishna Mint. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, there's feather, there's spread, there's no shading. It is quite a bit darker than we've seen from the fine on any other paper. Now, you'll remember that this paper had a lot of bleed spots that came through. It is really cheaply produced, and the performance rather shows that. The medium nib is much darker than we had with the fine. It feathers, it spreads, it doesn't shade, it looks kind of gross, but you could actually read it, and you just have to deal with all of the speckling that comes through from the last sample. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than we had with the medium, about the same tone as the fine, maybe even a bit lighter in quite a few areas. It feathers a little bit, feathers less than the medium, maybe a little less than the fine. It does have a tiny bit of spread, but I don't see that as being a tremendous deal here. Now, it shades better than it did on any other paper, so I guess you could call that a win for this notebook. Looking at the back of the page, you see a tremendous amount of show through. There is no using the back of this page. In fact, it dotted a ton of the pages on the other side. It's nice to find other inks in the same color family. I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is Ackerman number 18. Here is Diamine Inferno Orange. Here is Private Reserve Copper Burst. Here is Sailor Kyra Guro. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get about a little lighter than we had for the medium tone on the Clairfontaine. It does spread, which we would expect. It does have some feathering, which we would expect. Nowhere near the spread or feather that we had with the last paper. It's really doing better than that, without a doubt. And we have no shading. Very nice green tone for this paper. The medium is much darker than we had with the fine. It does feather, it does spread, it does not shade. None of these things are surprising for this paper, but I do think that what's there is incredibly manageable here. Looking at the stub nib, we see that the tone is about what we had with the fine. It does have the faintest amount of feathering. It's really the best as far as controlling the feathering of all three of the nibs on this paper. It does have a little bit of spread, but being a stub nib, it kind of gets hidden a bit. It does shade, so apparently on some of the worst paper, this ink does show some of its shading. Rather surprising. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that it really came through heavy on the medium and on the fine, not nearly as much on the stub. And in fact, the medium and the fine both did bleed through and touch the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? Generally speaking, looking at this ink, we largely have the same tone. There are some slight variations, and to be completely honest, unless you're looking at them right next to each other, you're probably not going to even see it. And as long as you're using half-decent, or especially if you're using good paper, there's not going to be any kind of performance issue for this ink. It's got no performance anxieties. So it's a dealer's choice. It's really ink your pen and go. It's a great ink for a lot of pens. I hope you got something out of this video, and if it leads to you wanting to try this ink, when you purchase it, let the retailer know where you heard about it, whether it's me or any other channel. Thanks for watching.